Welcome to the Future Media Podcast. I'm Ricky Sutton.
And I'm Alan Chappell. And this podcast goes deep into the collision of big tech
and the future of the world.
We explore how companies like Google, Meta, and Apple are impacting each of our lives.
I'm an investigative journalist.
I'm a privacy lawyer.
And every week we speak with experts to bring the unreported details into the light. Welcome back and welcome to the Future Media Podcast. Hi, Alan. How you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Ricky? You must be tired.
I am. That was 35 hours of flying back from New York via London and Doha. So yeah, look, very long trip, but I'm glad to be back in Australia. I've arrived back to terrible weather, but that's just one of those things. It was brilliant to see you in New York.
It was great to hang out a bit. I really enjoyed my time.
So it's kind of non-stop. I spent a ton of time with publishers and publisher CEOs over that time, really talking to them about preparing for a post-Google world. And there's kind of two post-Google worlds happening. So there's a post-Google search world emerging, which we're not going to talk about today because we're going to talk about the one that probably has had less coverage, but is probably immediately more important. So I wanted to really dive into the details of the ad tech breakup. So a simple shorthand for this is that Google has owned digital advertising for the best part of 20 years. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much, that's spot on, as they say.
Shorthand, easy peasy. And so, of course, that's been really difficult because everybody else that wants to play in the digital advertising world, which is basically everyone else on the web, has really, really struggled. And so this antitrust trial brought before a judge called Leonie Brinkema found that Google did have an illegal monopoly on several parts of the advertising ecosystem and that they were going to do something about that. And so the Department of Justice issued what's known as a remedies document where it's seeking to change that situation by changing the rules, maybe forcing some things to be sold, maybe forcing Google to change some behaviors, and all of the above to create a new and more competitive market. And Alan, I think you'd agree, in 25 years, we haven't seen anything like this, right?
No, this is absolutely unprecedented. And many of us would say it's a long time coming, but I would also say that many feared we'd never reach this day.
Me included, actually. I always knew that the case was strong. I've been following it and I've been living it for 20 years and following the case for 10. And so I knew that the case was really strong. It was whether somebody actually had the backbone to go after a company as large as Google and change this. But what's been fascinating to me in this phase that we're in now is the publishers are waking up to the fact that major disruptive change is coming. See, the changes that came through Google's era came bit by bit by bit by bit by bit. It was kind of a boiling frog, you know, it was like one change and then 6 months later, another one and then another one. You didn't really realize how far you'd come in that time. But now there's an abrupt right turn. Like it is, well, in fact, it's not actually, it's an abrupt reversal. It's a complete change of direction. And that's really starting to frighten the publishers. And the thing that I really wanted to get out of today with our conversation is to give them confidence that there are plans for handling this abrupt change, okay, but also why it's happening and what it actually means. Because if you view it top down, it looks like, well, it looks like a reason to retire, frankly, if you're in publishing. But there are ways to achieve this and come out the other side better. So it's to break down each little bit so people can refer to it and know what to do. So we're going to make the complicated simple, Alan. That's today's project.
Fantastic. And while you were heading back to Australia, I had the good fortune of interviewing Mark Hamer, who is, I guess, the DOJ's number 2 to Gail Slater, who is directly responsible for the Google ad tech case. And like any smart attorney, he was pretty measured in what he was willing to tell me. But one thing that I think is kind of interesting that may not be that well known, I mean, they're a law enforcement agency. And they have a very specific mandate that companies who have violated, the antitrust laws. Um, that said, there are folks who are hoping that they're going to come in and sort of wave a magic wand, and there just are limits to what the antitrust law can do. Uh, having said all that, boy, there's a lot in here, and I think that if the DOJ is able to get what they are currently proposing as remedies here in the ad tech case, uh, I think we're going to see a very different marketplace.
Very different. Yeah. And while you're out hanging out with your lawyer friends down at the DOJ, I've been hanging out with all my journo mates, journalism mates. And so I've spoken to four of the witnesses from the antitrust trials over the last 3 weeks. And I've been on stage with one of them, Stephanie Laser, who we'll talk about a little bit today. These are the people that actually had the courage to step up on stage as publisher representatives and go up against Google. That takes some serious courage. And so I think that we, as kind of thought leaders in this space, Alan, we have a responsibility to them to back them up and to make sure that everybody's confident where we're headed. The other thing that happened, which was really interesting, and to your point about the DOJ being a law enforcement agency, okay, is that publishers kept like hauling me up when I was talking to them, and they say, Ricky, you can't use words like illegal. And I'm like, no, I can. Okay. And they go, no, 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 this is competition law. And I'm going, it's still against the law. It's still illegal. The phrase legal keeps being used by the DOJ in its own paperwork. So there's still a certain sense of Stockholm syndrome amongst the industry that this can't be happening and it's not as bad as it seems to be, and that the change won't be as significant as it's going to be. And everything might just carry on and Google will find a way off the hook on this one. And I've spent a lot of this week saying, I don't think those are going to happen. But even if you're even faintly wrong, you have to prepare for that because that feels like the likelihood. How do you feel about it at the moment, Alan, on that?
Well, I think I'd be remiss if I did not mention Mark Mador, who is a newly appointed FTC commissioner, recently penned something which I think is absolutely fascinating and pertinent here. So I've been saying on this pod since we started it, Ricky, and saying, "Oh, let's pump the brakes here a bit because we've got 50 years of antitrust law in the U.S. where where they have made it really difficult to bring these cases, and they've made it even more difficult to win these types of cases." Okay, well, Mark Mador just wrote something basically repudiating the Robert Bork Chicago School, and basically saying if you're a conservative in the U.S., that approach is insulting to your intelligence. I think that's a direct quote from what he's saying. So, so the takeaway here is, and by the way, I'd encourage everyone to read that. It's not a very long document, and so certainly well worth the read. But if we were coming into this thinking that with the new administration there might be a different approach to antitrust enforcement, well, holy crow, they are, if anything, they seem much more aligned. They won't like me saying this, but they seem much more aligned with the Lena Khan, Jonathan Cantor approach. They are coming for the big tech companies, and they are reinventing the philosophical approach that's dominated the last 50 years.
100%. And so there is a whole series of podcasts we can have about the reasons that that's happening. But just for those who don't know, so the FTC is the Federal Trade Commission, which is a bit like the DOJ, but it goes after competition in a slightly different way. So the FTC and the DOJ are kind of wingmen in controlling competition and setting competition for the market. But you're absolutely right, Alan. I mean, so many people at the start of this were absolutely convinced that the Trump White House would never push forward with these, that deals would be done. But there are people all over the place and all over the Beltway in Washington stepping forward and saying, absolutely not. These tech companies have gotten too big. They are anti-competitive, and we are going to deal with them. So we have to prepare. And if you're a publisher, and if you're a CEO, or you're an ad tech guy, and you're an SEO person, if you're a journalist, okay, if you're the CRO, okay, everything you think you know is about to change. And so you have to start to prepare for a new future. And we are here. I hope, we're going to try and give you a softer landing, which is something, by the way, I've become experienced with all the flights I've just had. So let's use that as a transition to talk about what's actually going on here. Okay, so I'm going to dive in. I'm going to do most of the talking here because I'm going through the court documents and turning them into journalese so you can understand what they're saying. There are lots of technical details in here that you don't want to need to worry about. So Alan and I are going to break those down and make them simple for you. We want this to become a small and easy how-to guide to doing something that's enormous and completely life-changing. Okay, so we're trying to make the scary simple. So let's start here. If you haven't got a cup of coffee, grab one. This is what the court papers say. Google is engaged in a decade-long campaign of exclusionary conduct to acquire, protect, and entrench monopoly power in markets critical to digital advertising. Let me break that down to what that means for you as a publisher. It used to be the case that 70 to 80% of your earnings came from advertising. Now, for most publishers, it's somewhere around 50 or less. Okay, this is because you have less advertising coming to you, because there are less ads available to you, because there is more competition for that advertising, but also the price of those ads has fallen. So the amount of money you make from advertising has diminished, and as a result, publishers have moved their focus more towards subscriptions and other monetization strategies. Every single advertising executive I speak to in a media company tells me it's a tough advertising market, but it isn't. It's a tough advertising market for publishers, but it's not for those who are succeeding in advertising. So the growth in Meta and the growth in Google, 12% and 22% respectively, are all driven by advertising. So the advertising market is growing like a weed. The problem is that publishers are being denied access to that growth.
Yeah, and I would just say over the years, a lot of the impact of Google's anti-competitive behavior was somewhat masked by the fact that the market was growing so rapidly. And so, you'd be going up, single digit growth in digital ad spend, and then Google is going up, double and triple digit growth over certain years and in certain industries. And so, so some of this was masked by just the movement from offline. You used to call it brick and mortar, however you want to look at it, to online over the last 20, 25 years.
Absolutely. And so, if I have a look I recently went through News Corp's financials, latest quarterly financials, and I also sat down with the executives of News and spoke to them. And the only piece of their business that was going backwards was their news business that relied on advertising. Everything else was growing. And so I think it's very easy to believe that the market is broken and the publishing is in a terrible era of disruption. But it's not that publishing is doing a bad job. It's continuing to produce products that people really want to consume. The problem is that bad things have been done to it by an illegal monopolist. And it's happened, as you said, over 25 years or 20 years, actually, and bit by bit, and every single day. And eventually you just don't notice how big the corruption has been because you've accepted it in increments. Okay. And so this is the chance to change it. So as scary as this is, this revolution, okay, of breaking this is going to be good in the long term. It's going to be tricky in the medium term, and it's going to be scary in the short term. But we have no choice but to get there if we want to return to 70% of our revenue coming from advertising in a market that's now worth the best part of $1.4 trillion, and of which publishers get maybe 10 billion, which is absolutely and totally ridiculous. So let's talk about it. So the DOJ says in its remedy document, so the judge has found Google guilty of having an illegal monopoly in ad tech, number one. So the DOJ, Department of Justice, has a remedy document where it's asking for changes to be made, and a judge is considering that right now. The DOJ says that it wants the court, the judge, to unpick a series of anti-competitive acts that Google took to acquire and maintain monopoly power in the publisher, ad server, and ad exchange markets. Now, I want to kill another myth here. Publishers think this is about Google. It's not. It's about publishers. Everything in this court case is about returning competition and opportunity to the publishing industry. This is the Department of Justice putting its neck on the line for the global publishing industry. And I find it a little bit disappointing that publishers haven't recognized that and shown the level of appreciation that they probably should. I think that will come in time, but at the moment, they're kind of a little bit lost in all the noise. So the DOJ then says that Google created a multifaceted and ever evolving campaign of exclusionary conduct to enhance, mutually reinforce, and exacerbate this because it stitched together all of these distinct products that it promised were great for publishers. The ad server makes it so much more efficient. AdX, this will supply all the ads down this pipe to you. You'll do just great. The data, we've got all this amazing data. It will enhance and optimize everything you do. What it actually did was it created what the impression of a gilded cage that publishers all stepped into voluntarily and then suddenly found that there were no ads in there. And what Google actually did was took all of that data and all of that publisher information and used it to sell advertising into its own products in a process known as self-preferencing. And because every publisher had chosen to use all of the tools, and the tools only really worked if you used all of them, it found itself unable to leave when it realized it wasn't working. This is a process known as tying in court. You're the lawyer, Alan, but have I got that about right?
I think that's exactly it. If you basically you're conditioning the use of product A on the simultaneous use of product B. There was an additional complexity in there because there was while they were tying together their publisher technologies, they were also conditioning the use of some of those publisher technologies. If you unless you use them, you wouldn't get access to advertisers. So it was even more diabolical than just a simple tying case.
Yeah, there was evidence in the trials. Some of the evidence in the search antitrust trial, which Google also lost, which was relating to it being a monopolist in the search market and in the ad tech. I think the DOJ would have struggled to know which one to put in which case, actually. I think some of them fell into both parts. But to your point on that, in the search antitrust trial, there was an amazing email shared, an internal email by Google executives who were basically bragging about how they'd broken the laws of economics with this business because they could put prices up and no one would do anything. They could put the prices up as much as they wanted. They thought. I think they decided to halt it at 15% because they didn't want to go too far. But at the same time, they said that even though they were able to put prices up and charge anything they want, okay, it was more addictive than cigarettes, and it was the most profitable business since illicit drugs. And they were bragging about this in those terms in their internal emails. And then one of the ad tech bosses then said that publishers were so stuck in this machine, okay, that they could pretty much do anything they liked, and that it took, quote, an act of God to leave. I mean, if you want to talk about monopoly, I think that is monopoly number one, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And there was just it was always so difficult for publishers to leave for two reasons. I mean, there's all kinds of challenges from moving off of the Google technology, and so there's just a hard cost in leaving. But that actually wasn't even the major issue. The major issue was is that if you left, you would miss out on the demand side. And so publishers found themselves not just here, but in a whole bunch of different levels in this spiraling scenario where you're getting a lower and lower return on your investment, uh, and but not really able to make a switch.
100%. And all the while, Google's putting the cost of selling your ads up to 36% when its rivals were sitting at somewhere between 3 and 5%. You can see how eventually this was going to end up in the courts. When greed gets that, greed is not good in this model. Let's shorthand it to that. But you also had a situation where you had publishers in court giving evidence. There was Matthew Wheatland, who I met last week in New York from the Daily Mail, who basically said that you're silencing our journalism. This disenabled us to hire journalists and put resources in the newsroom because we were being suffocated from ad supply, which was our lifeblood and how we paid for our business. And we'll talk about Stephanie again in a minute. But Stephanie Laser said that she was forced to use, clunky, poor quality technology, and she was held ransom. She was the head of advertising at News Corp at the time, or programmatic advertising. She said she was held ransom on this kind of third world technology. And when she complained to Google and said she wanted to get off it, they basically accused her of being emotional. Okay. I think that, both the Daily Mail and News Corp are major global publishers with serious heft and weight. Okay. Both of them felt incapable and said so in court, testified in court that they were incapable of leaving. So it took an act of God is what it needed. Actually, it needed an act of DOJ, actually. So let's go with that. So let's talk about what this remedy phase from the DOJ actually says. And we're going to kind of break this down into bite-sized chunks to make it easy to consume and easy to understand. And so you can refer back at any point to any one of these pieces, okay? Because I think we're going to give it to you the way that you're thinking about it in your offices, all right? So there are a couple of Google products that are going to come up again and again and again in this part of our podcast. So the first one is AdX. Okay, so you'll have heard the name in the office, AdX. Your ad sales team will be extremely aware of what AdX is. The way I think about it, Alan, please correct me if you think my idiot version is wrong. But basically, AdX is a lake of ads, a giant, enormous lake of ads that Google has access to because it also views the advertisers and the advertising agencies as its customers in a two-sided market. So it has this enormous pool of ads to deliver where it chooses to deliver them. And so AdX is that part of the business. Alan, is that a fair description?
Yeah, I would just add that it's an exchange model. So like people think about, buying and selling stocks where you have a marketplace, and instead of stocks here, you're talking about a specific ad slot on a particular web page. And there's a technology that's what AdX does, that is enables an advertiser to bid on a particular piece of inventory at a particular moment in a particular time. um, and then on the other side, you've got the publisher who's saying, "Oh, great, okay, I'm going to put this, piece of ad inventory up for auction." Now, in a perfect world, the auction would generate interest from multiple advertisers, and then the publisher would get the best bid, or maybe the second best bid, because there's some variance in how the auctions work. But the idea here is that the publisher is able to get the maximum amount through open competition for a particular ad slot.
Yeah, and that was the deal. The deal was we will give our ad inventory to Google. Google will find us an ad at the highest yield and monetize it for us. That was the deal. So AdX is the first piece of technology. The second piece of technology is Google Ad Manager, or normally known in newsrooms as GAM, GAM. And so that's how the ad actually gets served onto the page. So the flow of ads will come down from AdX, and it may actually be some direct sold ads from the publisher, although that's increasingly less common, and I think probably about to become a lot more common. But that ad server then says, okay, well the ad is here, and we're going to put it in this slot, and we're going to measure it and make sure that we know that it's been delivered, and this is how much money you're making. And GAM is the second part of the chain. Alan, fair?
Yeah. So GAM is the piece of technology that is supposed to represent the publisher's interests so that the publisher can place a particular piece of ad of display onto this exchange. Now, for better or worse, the GAM is not a fiduciary of the publisher. And what I mean by that is that they are not technically beholden to serve the publisher's interests. Now, in an open and competitive market, that would be less important, because a ad server that was not acting in the best interest of the publisher, well, you could just replace them for a different ad server. Unfortunately, because of the way this market has been set up over the last decade or so, switching costs are really difficult. Um, And that's really, really important because as we're going to get into it, Google was expert at finding ways to manipulate the use of both the exchange and GAM in a way that benefited Google, sometimes may have benefited the advertiser, and almost never benefited the publisher.
Yeah. All right. So let's try to get into the facts and the details. Okay. So the first thing is that the way Google's advertising model works is effectively an auction system. And we alluded to this just now, or Alan alluded to that. So an advertiser wants to place an ad and it wants to reach a certain person at a certain time. A publisher on the other side of the equation has an ad spot that it wants to sell and it has an audience, and that audience might match the requirement of that particular advertiser. The Google technology in the middle acts like a dating agency to try and match the supply with the demand, the customer with the ad, and everybody should win. The way these auctions work, though, has always been incredibly opaque, deliberately so. And so no one's really been able to work out how Google's technology has worked. And so we hear about things like first look, last look, all kinds of different auction types. And I'm going to ask you, Alan, to explain some of those. But one of the things that the DOJ wants to break in this process is that it argues that the DFP AdX tie, okay, basically self-preferenced Google. So it gave Google the ability to send the ads wherever it wanted and to stifle advertising supply to publishers and some others. And so can you explain a little bit how first look works in a way that people can kind of understand a first look auction? Because personally, I'm stunned when I hear this explained, but please go ahead.
Sure. So First Look was a response to a publisher technique called header bidding. And header bidding was a response to some of Google's manipulation of the ad exchange marketplace. So bidding allowed a publisher to send their inventory out simultaneously to multiple demand sources. And by doing it so simultaneously, rather than via a waterfall approach, which is how most exchanges work, but by doing it simultaneously, you were able to maximize the amount of money that the publisher was able to get. Because if you think about it, if you have more buyers of a particular piece of inventory, chances are you're going to get more money for that. Okay, so in order to neutralize this idea of header bidding, which Google really didn't like because it restricted Google's ability to manipulate the auction, they they uh, they started offering or testing this first look, and it really it allowed publishers to give certain preferred buyers access to their inventory ahead of reserved inventory in their ad server. Um, and so it was a way to limit the flexibility for publishers to say only offer one particular buyer a certain price floor and offer a different buyer a different price floor. And that's really, really important because what would happen is that most publishers over time can learn that buyer A has different tendencies than buyer B. Oftentimes, buyer A because they have more data associated with their buy, will offer a lower price. And again, in an open market, that's probably okay. But in a market that's being manipulated, what would happen is that oftentimes it was Google that was offering a much lower uh, price for their inventory. So what the publishers were trying to do to combat that was to be able to raise the floor price for Google because they knew that Google was sort of had a tendency to manipulate their bids.
Let me explain that in a real world example for me in a newsroom. Okay. So when I was first told that programmatic was emerging in the mid 2000s, the mid noughties, I was told that this was going to be an amazing opportunity because Google had solved the problem of the fact that we couldn't sell our leftover or remnant inventory. So we could sell our premium ads, but all of these little leftover ads, we couldn't sell that volume. And so Google was going to solve that for us. What then very quickly transpired within 6 months or maybe a year was that Google was then back saying, well, look, as well as selling your leftover remnant inventory, why don't you let us sell all your premium inventory as well? And that was viewed in some newsrooms, and certainly the ones I was in at the time, that this was a way that we could save money and reduce headcount, and therefore we'd make the same money, but our costs would be less, and therefore our profit margins would be higher. But it assumed that Google was going to be an honest broker and that Google was going to continue to sell the ads at the rates we were selling them or even more, which was what was being promised. And because it was an auction, it was going to be, you mentioned two phrases that really, bring back memories for me, a bit haunting actually. So the first one was the waterfall idea. So the idea is that we're going to put the ad out to 10 different groups of people that might be interested in buying our ad. And we're going to choose, okay, the one that's paying the most, a bit like an auction, okay? And we were doing that already through various other technologies. And the idea was that the minimum price we'll take for that ad is, let's say it's $12 CPM. Okay, so that's the minimum price we're going to take. But the maximum price could be anything. And so as long as it was above 12, we'd put the auction out there and we'd find the highest priced one and we'd take that ad. And that worked for a while. Then when Google came in, it said, you don't need this waterfall approach at all. Our auction will solve that for you. You just tell us what the floor is, okay, and we'll be fine. But then over time, they told us in their data that our floor was too high and our competitors had dropped the floor below us and they were getting all the ads. And so if you want to have $100,000 worth of ads from this client, you're going to have to drop the price from 12 to 8 because your competitor down the road has dropped it to 8. And so then everybody dropped to 8, and then it was 6, and then it was 4, and then it was 2. And ultimately, the waterfall effect that became the Google effect had the result of reducing the value of all of our ads everywhere. And you and I, Alan, were on a podcast with Arez a few weeks ago, who was from Google, who talked about the fact that Google's Jedi mind trick here was to commoditize premium inventory to the lowest possible price for Google to be able to sell all of it. Because Google got paid on everyone and the publishers, had a cost, but suffered from that. And so that was the way I felt it in the newsroom.
Well, imagine you're playing poker where one of the people in a 5-person game can see everybody's hands.
Well,
That person's probably going to win almost every hand. And the only reason they won't win a hand is that they figure that everybody's going to be wise to them. So they might occasionally lose one.
and so I think this is important because in my experience of the way an auction works, okay, is that, you want to buy a painting. You put up your price, somebody else puts up their price, everybody puts their price up. You don't know what the final price is going to be. And then eventually a hammer comes down and goes, we bought it. That's not the way a Google auction works. The way a Google auction is that there's an ad that's available. Everybody bids for it. The only person that can see what's being bid is Google. And at the end of the auction, Google might decide it's going to take that ad and pay a little bit more, even though, and nobody else knows, okay, until after the event. So that's not an auction. That's a fix, isn't it?
Oh, it's completely a fix.
Right. So that, in a simple way, is the description of why that piece of the industry didn't work for publishers and only worked for Google. And because it was all done out of sight and behind all manner of mirrors and locked doors, okay, no one ever got to see just how broken it was until this antitrust trial, which is why we have people like the FTC and the DOJ. Am I not right, Anne?
You're right, and it's really remarkable how cathartic this last year or so has been in the ad space because um, there has been a lot of suspicion and very well informed suspicion about some of the practices Google has adopted over these last decade and a half. But to see it in open court and to see it all laid out I think was really eye opening for, well, certainly for the publishing industry, but also for the ad tech industry.
I've spoken a lot over recent years about the fact that truth can get lost under piles and piles and piles of detail. And the interesting thing about the internet is that the best way to make money in the internet is to try and ever finer slice a fact. So you want to say, hey, I want to advertise to 25 to 35-year-old white collar professional women on the east coast of Australia on a Tuesday that have shown an interest in buying this particular type of washing machine, and I want 50 million of them. There's no logic in that statement. The problem is that there aren't 50 million people on the west coast of America looking to buy a washing machine on Tuesday. And so there are people in the ad ecosystem that charge you for every step of that process, knowing that it's an impossibility to deliver. And so when you've got that much detail, you can just get lost in the detail and you try and fix every broken bit. What I've really enjoyed about the DOJ's approach to this is it's maintained its eyes on a North Star and said, this is clearly a monopoly. This is clearly all kinds of cartel behavior. This is clearly out of sight and can't be fixed and too complicated to fix bit by bit by bit. Okay, so what's happened is that the ad tech industry has cancer, and there's no point trying to fix the symptoms. We're going to have to remove the organ, and so it's gone really hard to break it at source, which is why it's such a big change and why it's so scary for the industry.
Oh, it absolutely is. It's this, you know, regardless of how this works out from here on in, we're going to see a very different marketplace just in the next couple of years.
My rule of thumb for everybody that's in this space and trying to figure out how to cope, it's a really simple one, actually. It comes from being an investigative reporter. It's don't listen to what people say, look at what they do. All right. So people will tell you a million different things, and that's the way we communicate. But the most effective communication of all is the outcome of what they've done. So let me tell you, Google's been saying for years and years and years that it will help publishers achieve X, Y, and Z, that it will help advertisers enable X, Y, and Z, that it will organize the world's information, that it will monetize all the world's advertising inventory. It hasn't done any of those things. What it's done is it's built an enormous monopoly of its own. And so it said those things, but it didn't do those things. So here's an interesting number for you. Put this in the back of your mind for your next board meeting. Google's revenue last year, 2024, was $350 billion. So the easy way to remember that is it's $1 billion a day. The entire news industry's advertising inventory last year was less than 10, okay, for the entire year. So Google earns, okay, in a week, what the entire news industry earns in a year. And it does it, a lot of it on the back of publishers' inventory and advertising and work. Add to that the fact that for every single ad that Google sells, this is its own numbers, it delivers a gross profit margin of 57%. Yeah. That's why it has an enormous market capitalization, which enables it to borrow money from the markets nearly free. And any publisher in the world, whether it's the New York Times or a local newspaper, has a market cap of 2.5 times earnings, which is shrinking. Google also has $108 billion in cash and cash equivalents in the bank, meaning that if it wants to buy a competitor, kill a competitor, silence a critic, hire a lawyer, it has all the power. The DOJ has ignored all of that and gone directly for the jugular. So let's talk about that, because there are phrases that you in the publishing industry, I am permissioning you to be rageful, okay? There are lines in the DOJ statement that make it very clear. This is an illegal monopoly. This money are, quote, ill-gotten gains, okay? Google has used naughty practices, my word, to use durable, supra-competitive prices, which means they charge way beyond what all markets would normally allow. Its unlawful conduct is what enabled it to have unparalleled scale, which gave it significant advantage over everyone else, okay? It used its big data to optimize ad tech services and build network effects and crush competition, right? These are all the words being used. So this is what the DOJ wants to do. And again, bullet point this in your notebook for your next board meeting. Number one, the DOJ wants to, quote, direct quote, unfetter the market from anti-competitive conduct, which basically means get rid of Google. Part two, terminate the illegal monopoly. Okay, it says in quotes, illegal monopoly. Stop pretending it's not. It is an illegal monopoly. Okay, that also means get rid of Google. Number three, deny to the defendant the fruits of its statutory violation. Statutory violation means illegal, okay? So it's illegal, 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 illegal. Please get this into your head. And when it says deny to the defendant the fruits, it's basically saying Google can't continue to earn $1 billion a day from fixing the market. Okay, it's going to stop that. And then four, this is the fourth thing the DOJ wants, to ensure that there remains no practices likely to result in the monopolization in the future, which means that we're not trying to punish Google, we're trying to end Google, or at least end Google's illegal practices. So look, four things, let's do it. Unfetter the market from anti-competitive conduct, terminate the illegal monopoly, deny the defendant the fruits of its statutory violations, and ensure there remains no practices in place likely to result in the monopolization in the future. This is a hard reversal of direction. The DOJ then says fines will not work. Fines are just the cost of doing business for companies the size of Google. It has to be a breakup. So stop denying that this is happening. It is happening on your watch. It's our responsibility to build behind it, okay? So sorry to be so passionate about it, but I need the industry to recognize that there's a kick in the seat of the pants here, okay? And they need to be ready to start to build for the future ahead, okay? Alan, what's your sense from the ad market? What's your sense? Are they in denial too? Are they feeling the same things as the publishing industry?
I think that the ad tech marketplace is in perhaps not as bad a place as the publisher marketplace, but there is still a Stockholm syndrome going on. I am still battling people are taking what Google says at face value even now. There was somebody, I said I was at an event in San Francisco, and there was somebody on a panel thanking Google for their leadership on privacy with this ad tool that they're building within their browser. I'm hoping to get that person aside. I don't want to embarrass them. I'm not going to name the company, but it's sort of like, how in the world are you running a viable business on anything that Google has enabled for you? Because you just, the answer is you can't. So there is a lot of people who are, I think, still in denial about the olden days where Google ran everything. And I think that's starting to shift. Now, it may take longer than you or I hope it does, or hoping it will take, but it's going to take some time. But I don't think it's debatable now that we're entering in a new era.
Oh yeah, and we need to, because if we don't, the open web won't survive. Okay, so that's why both sides of politics are on board with this. The internet is now almost a public utility in driving global GDP, global value. The price of your car insurance relies on how much money pours through, the open web, because it's what's driving the entire economy. And governments can't afford for the open web to end, or for the open web to be owned by one commercial company. It cannot allow that to happen. Politics meets business meets public need, public utility. So let's talk about the big stuff. Okay, so just so you know, that was the small stuff. So this is what's coming next. So there's a word that you're going to hear a lot, divestiture. It basically means sell off or carve off or take away from Google in this particular scenario. So the DOJ says in its document that divestiture is the most important and most effective of antitrust remedies. What it means is it's going to force Google to sell off its illegal tools. As well as that, though, the DOJ also wants behavioral changes, but it basically says that changes, telling Google to change stuff, might or might not work. Fines won't work. We've seen that Google's been fined $12 billion. It hasn't made any difference. So they're actually going to break these things off. So number one, the first thing on the chopping block is AdX. Now, AdX, if you remember, is the ad exchange where all of these ads that sits between the publisher and Google and the advertiser. Now, the DOJ clearly says that the bad behavior here was that Google used its own tool, AdX, to effectively siphon off premium advertising for itself, and lower value ads to everybody else, and then denied everybody else that wanted to use its best tools to best target its products. Everybody got a worse version than they got. So it was always going to be ahead in everything it did. And so for publishers that keep telling me, and they haven't actually so much, to be honest, in the last 6 months, but until 6 months ago, they told me all the time. They basically said that without AdX, we're over. That's not true. It's without the ads that are in AdX, you're over, not AdX. AdX was just the tool. And you think those two things are the same thing, but they're not. Okay. AdX was the problem, not the solution. Publishers couldn't leave because they were too afraid to leave AdX because it meant they wouldn't get the ads because Google owned the taps and the pipes and the water. Yeah. And so, that was the crisis. That's what Stephanie Laser was talking about when she was saying I was held ransom and I couldn't leave. And so this is what the DOJ wants. It wants Google forced to sell AdX to free ad supply to an ad demand to all of the customers. So AdX becomes, no longer owned by Google, it becomes owned by somebody else. Now, I'll get to that in a second. So the first thing that's going to happen is that if we still have to wait for the judge to say yes to all these things, but this is what's being demanded, and it's the same judge that found Google guilty of being the monopoly in the first place. So the first thing that will happen is that a technical committee will be put together who will have the job of finding a new buyer for AdX. But then on the behavior side, the DOJ wants an API, an open API, which is basically a signal of what ad supply is available, wants an API added to AdX that anyone with any ad supply and ad demand can see. So it means that Google can't fix the pipes or fix the taps. The water has to flow uniformly through to everybody. Everybody has to have the same opportunity. So a technical committee to decide who owns it, and an API to make public all of the information within it. And then thirdly, that Google is banned from having an ad exchange to compete with it for a decade. So that's remedy number one. Alan, any thoughts on that?
No, I think that's right on. The only thing I would just add is that these are the government's proposed remedies, and we haven't talked much about Google's proposed remedies. I'm not sure we really need to, because their remedies are basically nothing. Really, really nothing.
Yeah, I know. Well, maybe we'll get to that at the end if we have time. But to be honest with you, I'm a little bit bored of listening to Google, and so I think this is an opportunity to listen to someone else. So remedy number 2, DFP. All right. So DFP is effectively what used to be DoubleClick. All right. It's basically the technology platform that puts together the delivery of the ads onto the pages. Now, when you tie DFP and AdX together, Google forced customers to use tools that they wouldn't have otherwise used and to pay prices they wouldn't have otherwise paid. And that's why they were trying to head to header bidding that Alan was telling us about. The idea that you let everybody bid for your ad and then you take the one that pays the most. Instead, Google killed that and said, no, ask us and we'll tell you, and then didn't tell you the truth. So the way the DOJ describes this in its document is, and I quote, these changes weaponized, their word, I mean, that's a proper word, weaponized DFP's auction logic to benefit Google's ad tech products, decreased product quality, and harmed competition. Weaponized. Yeah. Oh, by the way, guys, it's illegal and it's weaponized. Okay. Now, what the DOJ is demanding and wants now is that DFP is made open source. Now, let me tell you what that means. So this is a tool that Google pushed the prices up again and again and again to get to 36 cents on the dollar without telling you and hid it. It now wants it made open source, which means it's free. That means that when you get a $4 CPM ad and you can barely keep the lights on, that $4 ad's now going to be $5.20. Well, that's a good outcome, but it might be $52 because of the AdX change. All right. So think about what that means, about whether or not advertising has a part of your future. Several publishers I've spoken to very recently, and I mean literally in the last 2 weeks, have said to me, advertising will never be a part of our future. And I'm like, have you paid any attention to what's happening in this ad breakup? Yeah, if your ad supply is $52 CPM instead of $4 CPM, is advertising still not part of your future? You're missing something here. Okay, so we need to recognize that we're not fighting tomorrow with the weapons we have today. We're fighting tomorrow with something totally different. So be ready for that. So the first thing is DFP becomes free, and it's also sold again. So Google can't fix the system anymore. It's sold to, quote, here's a quote, assure the public freedom from its continuance. How's that? I mean, these guys are, they deserve a job in journalism, these DOJ guys. That's terrific. Now, I want to talk to you about something that keeps coming up again and again and again, which is publishers are terrified of the cost of getting out of Google's monopoly. Like, do we have to build a new ad server? Do we have to do new deals? Do we have to unstitch all of the work? Do I need to get rid of everybody that works in SEO? Do I get rid of everybody that works in ad tech in my business? The answer is there is going to be fundamental and significant disruption, okay? But there's a plan for that, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. So the DOJ has proposed, so get rid of DFP, get rid of AdX, both out of Google, free the information, enable everybody to serve their ads through the tech with the data. Complete game changer. CPM sell-through and CPM ad yield altogether should go up. So other things that the DOJ has demanded, 3 phases to reduce the costs for you as publishers to deal with this and reduce the disruption, which is frankly terrifying, and then also to spark this new competition on pricing and sell-through. So the first of these phases is to force Google to provide an API, I mentioned this earlier on, like a signal, a digital signal, that can integrate with all different sources of ads. So you don't have to now just get your ads from AdX, you can get it from a multiplicity of other ad supply platforms. And so that enables you to have more competitive auctions, it enables header bidding. We can go back to the plan that publishing had 5-7 years ago, or it might be even 10 years ago now, that would have worked, that was killed by Google. Now we can actually have it. So header bidding companies are seeing their value on the stock market explode at the moment because they can see an opportunity to fix that. The other thing is that the intention is that by freeing AdX and freeing DFP and making both of them work with non-Google products means that publishers won't need to get rid of AdX and won't need to get rid of GAM. They can keep them because they're now free, but now they're competitive. And so you don't need to go and start to build new tech or start your tech team working on a massive OpEx and CapEx project. You can probably keep them. And then, as I said, the third thing is that Google is forced to sell DFP with a court-appointed trustee that will sell it, okay? And that makes it not part of Google's competitive marketplace. So let me boil that down into really simple terms. You don't need to rip out your existing ad tech. Your ad tech that you have will start to work the way it was meant to work. There will be new competition that should lead to higher CPMs and higher sell-throughs, and you don't need to retrain all your staff because your staff will still be working with the same tools. Alan, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, those are hugely significant moves. I know in a bit we're going to talk about maybe some places where the DOJ could have gone a little further, but for now, these things just on their own are really significant. And I think my favorite part of this is the forced funneling of certain money into escrow so as to support the publishing community in terms of how they navigate the transition. So that to me sounds great because I think that's probably one of the things weighing on most publishers' minds right now.
100%. So you've absolutely hit the nail on the head. One of the things I've absolutely loved about following this antitrust actions from the DOJ is that in each of the cases that they've brought, oh, and by the way, here's another myth busting. There are 3 antitrust cases that Google's lost. People think there's 2. They keep talking about 2. There's 3. So Google lost the first antitrust case on its App Store. Everybody's forgotten about that one. Okay, but it then lost the antitrust trial on the search tools, which is leading to the sale of Chrome and a whole series of demands almost exactly like this that I've covered previously. And then there's this one, which is the breakup of the ad tech. So 1, 2, 3. In fact, great line from this is the way to remember it. One of the guys from the DOJ said the day it happened, he said, Google's once, twice, 3 times a monopolist. I use that line almost every time I'm on stage. I'll use it again today. And so escrow, let's talk about that. This is where the DOJ has pulled absolutely gangster moves, brilliant ones. Now, actually, just before I get to escrow, let's talk really quickly about another gangster move that they pulled in the search antitrust trial. So after the advertising monopoly, the thing publishers are most afraid of is all their content gets stolen and reused by AI to create Gen AI, so its product has no value. So the DOJ's approach to that was to say to Google that you're not allowed to deny publishers access to search if they say that they don't want their content used for AI training. So up to now, whenever anybody says, I don't want my content used for training, thanks, Google has said, that's fine, that's okay, just delist from search and we won't use it. But no publisher can delist from search. That's traffic suicide. So they can't do that. The DOJ's remedy wasn't to fix copyright or to go back and rewrite a new law or to do anything else. It just basically said, well, Google, you can't do that. They're perfectly entitled to still be in search and not be used for training. It was the simplest solution ever. And I'm gutted I didn't think of it. That was absolutely gangster. The second absolute gangster move was the one you just mentioned, escrow. So what they've said to Google here is, Google in court recently said, we're going to appeal for 10 to 13 years, right? So all these changes, 10 to 13 years, right? The publishers won't survive 10 to 13 years, right? And Google's got all the lawyers to do that. So how do you stop them doing it? Well, the DOJ went to the judge and said, we want 50% of all of the revenue from AdX and GAM, which are the two illegal products, put into escrow, put into a locked bank account. So Google can't access it, but nor can anyone else. But when the judge decides, they can release it to everybody. But we want this money in escrow so that it reduces the costs and the difficulty for publishers to be able to adapt to this new world that's going to happen. So I did the research on this. It's $11 billion a year, backdated to when the court case started. This is a game changer. A publisher might get a check from the DOJ for $100 million to adapt to this new advertising model. This is a very significant clause, and it's right at the end of the document, deep down the document, but it clearly states escrow, and that's fantastic. Google has fought that tooth and nail. By the way, it's not what you say, it's what you do. All right. In this case, it's what they say. This clearly really, really hurts them, and so they're talking a lot about it in court. So that means we should do it. So, there's a lot in here. I think we've covered a lot, but let's get down to the last of this. Data. So Google has been a winner in everything that it's done because it can see the whole of the internet. It can see the whole of the publisher's behavior. It can see the behavior of every user and consumer. There are 3.2 billion people that are logged into Google, sharing their data voluntarily or without realizing with Google. Every publisher shares their data with Google because they plug it all into the ad platforms and the ad networks. Google can see the entire internet, which means Google can send an ad left, right, up, down, or loop the loop. It can do anything it wants with everything until now. And so the ruling is that Google's data isn't exclusive to data, it's everyone's. And Google will be forced to share all of the data that DFP uses for its auctions with all players, which means there's going to be competition for the first time in the way that ads are delivered, which means there's going to be competition to find the best audiences, which is often publishers. And there's going to be competition to get the best results on an ad campaign, which means that there's going to be competition for price, which means prices will go up instead of down. That's competition in action. The second thing is that the data that is shared with advertisers who decide where they're going to place their ad, for years, Google has been saying to the market, there's no value in publishing, people don't love publishing, news is out of fashion. No, it's never out of fashion. People still wanted it. It was just Google wanted the money, so it was fashionable for Google to say it wasn't in fashion. Now that lie is going to be exposed, and publishers and advertisers are going to get back into a happy marriage again. The third thing is Google can't use the first-party data that it's gathered from all our audiences to self-preference its own product. It can't push an ad only to itself. I'll give you a real-world example. Publisher told me about 3 months ago. No, sorry, it wasn't a publisher. It was a Google employee told me 3 months ago that Publisher X in Australia places their ads, their video on their webpage and has Google sell those ads on its webpage, the pre-roll ads on the video. And at the same time, the publisher has been told by Google to put the video on YouTube as well, because they'll sell the ads on YouTube as well, where there's a lot more traffic. And therefore, if you put your video on both places, then you'll be a real winner, and we'll sell the ad on there as well. So the publisher says, well, we sell our video ads on our article pages for $30 CPM, $30 per view or per 1,000 views. And Google said, well, we can't do 30, but we will do 4, but we'll guarantee we sell all of it. So the publisher unwisely said yes. And then that meant that when the publisher put their video on YouTube, okay, and Google said, we'll sell it for you there, the publisher also got $4 CPM for its video sitting on YouTube. But what the publisher didn't know, because the data wasn't public, okay, is that Google was selling that ad to the advertiser for $80 CPM. So it was telling the publisher the price was 4 that the market would accept, but the price the market would accept was 80. And the reason the publisher would pay 80 is because Google had more targeting data and more customer information than the publisher did. And so Google made $76 profit on selling an ad on a piece of content created at the publisher's expense. Corruption. Monopoly. So that ends. And then finally, publishers get the same data as Google. So if Google's selling it for $80, the publisher knows it's sold for $80. And then the publisher can negotiate for a reasonable amount of that share. And then finally, the last one, which I'm really glad they've got in here, is an anti-retaliation clause. It basically says that a policeman, it's not a policeman, but an official will be appointed by the government to ensure that Google doesn't turn aggressive on people that try to take advantage or to just to stop Google beating up on people and hurting the victim further. So that's a lot of detail, Alan. I mean, this is an exhausting document and exhaustively investigated, but a pretty good one.
I would agree. The one thing I would add, and it seems very relatively small given all of the things that you've already stated, but I found it funny, so I'm going to share it. The required training so that Google employees would no longer abuse the attorney-client privilege, and that they might have fewer instances of evidence spoliation if we find ourselves in this situation again in a few years down the road.
Yeah, let's not forget what happened there. I think that might very well actually be our next podcast, Alan, maybe. So in the case, just for all of you that didn't know, Google, everyone's best friend / illegal monopolist, basically advised senior executives that they might not want to send emails internally about their business behaviors because they could potentially be raised in a antitrust trial, for example. And so as a result, if they wanted to have a conversation about something that they didn't want to be used in that trial, maybe they should do it in Google Chat instead, because by the way, coincidentally, that Google Chat was deleted every 24 hours. As a result, more than 90% of the CEO's his emails were retained, but 90% of his communications in chat were deleted across all of the senior executives. And there was a great line from the judge that basically said, it's not really a surprise then that we don't have a smoking gun in this particular case, given that the evidence was deleted. Now, when you're brought to an antitrust trial, and to any trial, Alan, you're a lawyer, but you know this is the case, you're put under an evidence hold. And so you're told that any detail and information and emails and other documents that may pertain to the case have to be retained, okay? And if you don't retain it, that is a pretty serious situation. There has been probably, don't know if it's the most comprehensive, but there's been a pretty determined effort here to ensure that that stuff doesn't exist. And that's not my words. That's what the judges have said. So there is now a separate court case that doesn't yet have a date, which is going to be an absolute blockbuster where Google is going to be hauled up for spoliation of data and evidence that basically says you tried to delete everything so we couldn't find you guilty. And just to show you how serious that was, Leonie Brinkema, the judge in this final case, said at the outset of the case, now, let's first of all just say Leonie Brinkema looks a bit like your grandmother, okay, but she is scary as fuck. She literally, she's the judge that brought the only case against a September 11 terrorist, okay, and she tracked down the CIA's secret black sites for torture after 9/11, and she did this on her own time and with her own efforts. Okay, she is an absolute gangster, and she said at the start of the Google case when she learned about all this evidence being dismissed, she literally said to the lawyers at Google on the desk on the first day, she said, "Given that you've done this, and there's no real dispute that you have done this, every time something comes up and there's no evidence that says that it's right, I'm going to assume you did it, right? Because if you didn't, why did you delete all this stuff? So I'm going to assume the worst on every occasion when I don't have evidence to the contrary." And and like it's back to what we said. Don't believe what they say because they deny it. Look at what they did. They deleted the messages, right? And she literally said that on day one. I'm going to assume the worst. So just so you know, and I think the writing was on the wall from day one at that point. I'm not even sure Google's lawyers tried that hard after that. So look, this has been a simply amazing period that's going to be remembered in history. Okay. This is a game changer for the law. It's a complete and total game changer for the open web. It's a complete game changer for the publishing industry. And because I'm here for the publishing industry and I'm of the publishing industry, and because I'm paying attention to this and I'm not working in the publishing industry day to day, I feel a really strong personal need to try and put this out to you because you have to start to prepare. We've won the war, we have to win the peace. So start to devote more time to what you're going to be doing tomorrow because it's not going to be like yesterday. And I think we have the opportunity for the first time in 20 years to dare to dream and start to think about what is the new media we generate if $300 billion worth of advertising drops into our bank accounts. What happens when money is no longer a problem? So think about that. Alan, do you want to wow the ad tech industry? Are you feeling optimistic for them too? Because they must be sitting on an absolute goldmine here.
Well, so I think it's mixed within the ad tech industry. I think that there are people in the ad tech industry that are assuming that this is going to solve everything for them, and then more specifically that the government has any interest in maintaining the specific problem that your technology tries to solve. And so I think you're going to see a lot of things change, and there's going to be a whole bunch of folks in the ad tech world who are just going to be out of business or be forced to pivot pretty significantly.
Let me ask you this. I know we're running a little bit over time, but this feels like a really, really important podcast app. Mate, what happens to privacy now? Because publishers enabled with their own first party data without it being limited or traded or reused or blended, we're going to have a world where publishers are going to put their first party data into the new independent GAM and the new independent AdX and the new independent competitive market. You know, a CPM on an ad on the Financial Times first party, knowing it's going to a $650,000 C-suite executive in a major bank, going to be highly valuable, isn't it?
Oh, it absolutely is. So I think that kind of stuff is going to change pretty significantly for publishers. I don't necessarily know that that is going to be better or worse for privacy. I think that there's still going to be a ton of data collected. I suppose that if publishers are able to keep it within their defined ecosystem so that it isn't changing hands in the way that it had been, over the last 15 years, that will number one, I guess, be somewhat better for privacy, and also may implicate some of the laws that have been passed over the last 5 to 7 years, including GDPR in Europe. It may change a little bit some of those implications.
100%. I mean, the repercussions downstream are enormous. I think, if you were to ask the average person in the street, I use the Australian pub test as the way to do this, right? If you were to walk into a pub and ask Australians, are you happy for your data to be owned by the Wall Street Journal? I think their view is probably okay, right? I kind of understand that. They're personalizing my information. They know what stocks I hold, they're helping me get the information I need. Do they want their information to be held by a third-party ad reseller that's run by a bot farm in Belarus? They feel a little bit less confident about that. And the problem with Google's data is that Google's never really been clear on where Google's collected its data from. I have no doubt it's collected first-party data on its own customers, and it's used lookalikes to connect it to publishers. But it's also probably, I don't know, but probably bought it from every single trader that's available and tried to put that in there as well. And what you've ended up with is an incredibly large pool of perhaps true, not true, maybe true, half true information that's been turned into, kind of been spun into gold when it might not even be gold. And all that's going to go away. So if it does become first party data, then surely priority number one of the publisher must be to gather as much of it as they can and to protect it very, very carefully.
I agree on the protecting it. And I actually also agree on the getting as much data as you can, but then that has some tension when it comes to privacy. But I would agree with you that if the only two options were the Belarus bot farm and the Wall Street Journal wins every day. But I do think that it would be really helpful to. I think it would be really helpful to have some standards around how this data can be collected. But really, over the last decade or so, it's just you've been up against Google, who gets it from everywhere. It was 2012 where they, by design, just combined all of their data into one big pot. So literally, with the footprint that they have across the internet, that's a pretty significant amount of data. And that has implications because if everybody who has data is trying to compete with that, you have a race to the bottom where everybody collects as much as they can.
Don't we? So the only competition they managed to create was in bad stuff. So let's look at it like this. This is day one of the future. Okay. And I think that's the only way you can look at it. It's too hard to look back. You have to look forward. So it's day one of the future. You and I, Alan, are going to go through line by line, day by day, issue by issue. We'll track this down. We'll break it down. We'll share it. But day one of the future is where we're at. And so it's not to be afraid of. If you're in a monopoly situation, you can't win. If you're in a chaos situation, you can win. That's a good thing. All right. So let's go down that path. Alan and I are here to help where we can. Send us questions, follow our newsletters, but we will absolutely break this down as it happens. And there is a long race to be run. Personally, I'm thrilled. I'm glad the toxic race we were in is ending.
I am as well. And I think we're going to see a very different marketplace over the next year or two.
All right. Thanks, Alan. We'll catch you next time.
All right. Thanks, Ricky.
Thanks for tuning in. The Future Media Podcast is a production of Future Media and Ricky Sutton.